All right, I'm Melody Blevins, and I talk fast, so get ready to listen fast. My organization is Washington County Schools with Jan, though we need to talk about our numbers because I don't think our total number of schools matched up. So we have about 8,500 students, 600 teachers, 40 administrators. I'm really focusing on students with disabilities. So I added that in there, about 1,300 students with disabilities, which is 15.5% of our population. Per pupil expenditure is important there because that's kind of on the medium to lower end for this area, and that's where all our revenue comes from, funding comes from. Like Josh was saying this morning, it's hind ends and seats, as he so eloquently put it. So I need to give you kind of a background, brief history of special ed. Basically, there was a law that came out, it's called the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, that introduced some basic tenets of special education, some basic principles. Two of those that I'm going to talk about today are free and appropriate public education. So before this came out, you could take a child that had any type of disability, whether it's mental, physical, whatever, and a school could actually say, no, we will not educate your child. I was talking about this recently with somebody, and they reminded me of the somewhat controversial scene in Forrest Gump where the mom convinced the principal, shall we say, to let him attend school because he didn't make the cutoff by IQ. That was a real situation. So, it's a type of discrimination, and discrimination is never okay. So that's where free and appropriate public education entered the realm here, as well as least restrictive environment. What that means is we take a child, we put them in the most, if you want to use the word normal setting, we like the word typical, but normal, kind of like layman speak there, as possible. Okay, so if that's the regular classroom, that's great. If it's a regular classroom with some support in that classroom, that's fine. If we need to pull them out a little bit, gradually increasing until we meet their needs is basically what it's all about. But it starts by putting them in that typical classroom first. So special education is governed by the law called Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, it's been reauthorized several times. It came out of All Handicapped Children Act. It's actually, some people would even argue it's an extension of civil rights because we're talking about discrimination. So what this did, it increased participation in the least restrictive environment, which is, like I said, the regular classroom. There were less students with disabilities being removed from the classroom. So what would happen in the past is, hey, you're not meeting, standards for second grade reading. I'm going to pull you out of your entire reading block and I'm going to help you, which sounds really good on the front end, right? But then they've missed all of second grade reading. So what happens? They go to third grade reading. Now they're behind because they missed all of second grade reading. They probably didn't really catch first grade reading, so you can see it snowballs. So we first keep them in the classroom, meet their needs there, and then we support them as well as we can. Also implemented co-teaching, which is like one of my big things. That's what I spend my whole day doing. I go into classrooms, I teach with those teachers. I pull my students out when it's appropriate to do so, and we meet their needs at their level. But they are first, what we like to say, first, general education students first. It improved access for students that are at risk. So you've got kids, you have to meet qualifications to be able to receive special education. There's a lot of kids that need help but don't meet those qualifications. So it improved access for kids at risk. So if I go into a third grade classroom and there's a child in there that's struggling in reading but they don't have an IEP, I can still help them because I'm in there. So my change event was that we moved in Washington County Schools from being kind of segregated as far as special education goes. I probably should have added to this slide that prior to 2014, we had so many students being pulled out of the classroom for what I would say are probably very needless things, but I have strong opinions about this. We would actually have students, typically, especially in middle school and high school, spending more than half their day outside of a regular ed classroom. How can you call yourself a 7th grade student if you're never in your 7th grade classroom? So that's what kind of where we were, to the point that 2014, here comes inclusion and co-teaching, and we just threw them all back in the classroom. So again, how can you call yourself a 7th grade student when you're sitting in that class and you're on a kindergarten reading level? Can you imagine feeling just totally and completely out of place? Of course, there was a little bit of backlash from the teachers as well. There should be, because they weren't given the support they needed to. So we I'm getting ahead of myself, but as you can see, it probably failed. We could say it failed at first, so we had to pull back a little bit. Okay, now we're going to kind of do this gradually. We're going to make decisions about inclusion case by case where it's appropriate. We're still kind of evolving, and we're still moving towards more of an inclusive model with co-teaching. So kind of looking at the reasons for change here. You had lots of external, so there's a big push in Tennessee right now for our students to be reading on grade level in third grade. Third grade is does anybody know why third grade is so critical, except for all you education people?
Isn't that where you don't learn to read, you read to learn?
Yeah, you have that shift. That is actually what a lot of places will use as far as how much room do they need in their jail. They'll look at third grade reading standards. If a student is not on or above grade level by the end of third, fourth grade, there's probably I think National Reading Panel says it, they're 2/3 more likely to be on welfare or in jail. So it's critical. 8 years old. Your life is being planned out by the time you're 8. So there's a huge push from Tennessee. Allison mentioned that we were like way behind. I'm from Maryland. I moved here 7 years ago, and I really thought that I had stepped back in the time machine because our educational practices were that far behind. You talk about a sense of urgency. The change event was top down. It was leader imposed. It was kind of really even bigger than that. It was from our state Board of Education, top down as far as, okay, here's what they say we need to be meeting expectations. Now our director of special ed says, here's what you need to be doing. And it was completely and totally leader imposed. It was planned. They made a conscious effort, but it was revolutionary. I mean, it spun the whole entire county so out of control that we're still reeling from it a little bit. Positives. Okay, so we did a really good job about celebrating short-term successes. We still are doing that to this day. If somebody has a good co-teaching model, at my school, I say all of my what we call inclusion teachers, so all of my teachers that have students with disabilities in their classroom, they're rock stars. So people will come and watch us co-teach because, like we were saying earlier, that's a good way to see, okay, what are they doing? How can we replicate it in our school? They were good about recognizing success, rewarding employees appropriately, and they were good about responding to resistance. So obviously with change you're going to have resistance. There was a ton of resistance. I mean, they just came in and said, this is what you're doing, go with it. They gave no support whatsoever. When it failed, I mean, the year that it was implemented and it failed, it wasn't even by Christmas time where it was like, oh, you couldn't even say the word inclusion. You couldn't say the word co-teaching around Washington County schools because it had failed that badly. So they responded to that with a couple changes in leadership, but nothing terribly drastic. But education and communication. I can't tell you how many professional development sessions I've sat in on. I have led. I'm now part of a regional special ed collaboration team. So we are getting so much, and it's not just from our county, it's coming from Nashville, the Department of Ed in Nashville. So they're bringing education and training to us to respond to where we need to be to meet our students' needs. They're helping us facilitate and support it by being able to go and look at all the schools that are implementing it, who's being successful with it, how do we then replicate that. Drawbacks. So there was definitely no attention to the unfreezing stage. There was no unfreezing whatsoever. It was just like, bam, go. So then there was no buy-in. So the people that had to be implementing it, so the special education teachers, which were still a little bit resistant to it, but then the gen ed teachers, the regular ed teachers, absolutely no buy-in whatsoever. So that's why it was so hard to actually implement. There was no motivation for change. There was no understanding of why. But when you throw out statistics like that and saying, hey, if our students aren't reading on grade level by third and fourth grade, we're pretty much planning a life for them that is just not so desirable. There was no training specifically on inclusion and co-teaching. You take just about anybody, and I mean, you just pull like 10 people from the education world, they all have different definitions of inclusion, all have different definitions of co-teaching. So there needs to be some cohesiveness there, and there wasn't. And then they didn't really give enough attention to the vision. What is the vision? I'm not even really sure if there was a vision at that time. So it's really hard to implement change if you don't have a vision. Like I said, initially, it was a total failure. We're about 3 years out now. We have definite improved access for all students. Like I said, students that don't qualify for an IEP, I can still give them what they need. Updated practice, like I said earlier, coming from Maryland, it was so outdated. So this is things that have been going on in Maryland for years, decades. Giving them what the students need. I mean, that's ultimately what we're there for, is to help the students, give them what they need. As far as at my school, there were 3 schools in the county that were on what's called a focus school list, which was that your students with disabilities were not performing as well as they should. So 3 years out, 2 out of those 3 schools have now exited off that list. Like I said, I'm very pro-inclusion, co-teaching, so I was so happy about this change, but we still have more work to do, and we're still working on that. The leaders that didn't understand this change, it's not going so well in their schools. The ones who did, it's going much better in their schools, and that just makes a lot of sense. Again, works well for me because it helps me serve all my students that I need to serve in the most effective way. All right.